Graduate Student Network because we recently changed the entity name so that we are more representative of the interests of graduate students. So today we're here to talk about research agendas and the strategic element and components of that concept. Our time together is brief, so I'm going to get straight to it with our agenda. We're only going to cover three things, right? First, I'm going to go provide some notes on what a research agenda is and how it's been used in higher education. Then I'm going to facilitate a breakout networking session, which I would say is the meat of this session where we get to connect with each other and hear the different projects that we're working on. And then finally, I'll close with the sharing of a resource guide that's developed. Because, spoiler alert, you're not going to develop a research agenda within the next hour. It's a process that will take a good chunk of your career. And it's one of those things where the sooner you spend time on it, the sooner you work on it, the more rewarding that career can be, right? So, one quick housekeeping note, this session is being recorded, except for the breakout session. So, in terms of the content and the resource sharing, this will be later uploaded onto YouTube. But during that breakout session, when you're in that conversation with each other in dialogue, that won't be recorded. All right. So we'll jump right on in. First off, what is a research agenda? When I was doing my research for this or preparation for this session, it's surprising how little attention is given to this topic. It gets a bit meta because we're talking about research, right? But I did find an article from Ertmer and Glazewski who define a research agenda as both a noun and as a verb, right? So in terms of being a thing, an object, they call a research agenda a framework that allows one to attack a topic from multiple vantage points. In terms of it being a verb or a course of action, they describe it as the ways that one takes to organize their interests and work. And I think it's interesting to sit with this definition for a bit because that idea of multiple vantage points really resonates, right? I don't know where you're all from or how you entered higher ed, but I can imagine that you have a variety of different interests, right? Some of you come at it from a policy or finance perspective. Others might have a more sociological interest. If you're like me, then you came into higher ed because of student affairs, right? So that idea of multiple vantage points means we all bring to the study of higher education a different perspective and different ways of defining what problems to work on, as well as how to go about solving those problems. In terms of the actions that we take to organize, I think that's important to emphasize because a research agenda calls for a certain level of intentionality, right? That's the title of this session, right? Strategic scholarship. The idea is you don't want to do your scholarship by accident, right? By happenstance, where you just go from one project to another because, your supervisor invited you to do it, right? The sooner you can clarify what your interests are and how you can work towards enacting them, the better, because that's you enacting your agenda, right? And not someone else's. So that's research agenda as a general topic. I found another article by Santos and Horta on how it shows up in higher education specifically. So what they did was they conducted cluster analysis and linear modeling. So it is a bit quantitative, but they developed a framework to describe how research agendas show up in higher education specifically. And they noted that there are two main clusters that are consistent, whether you're a new scholar or an established one, or whether you're a frequent contributor to scholarship or part-time, right? So the two clusters, the first one is what they called a cohesive approach, and they characterize that as the gradual development of expertise. This is where each project has a piecemeal contribution to the overall scholar's work, right? And that scholar seeks convergence and stability over time, right? So this is the type of research agenda where you get published, you present at a conference, and then you cite your own work as you build that momentum. And what they found was this type of approach requires long-term investment, right? Because you are spending years on a given subject or a domain within higher education when you pursue this approach. The other cluster that they characterized is called trailblazing. This is typically multidisciplinary in nature, right? And it intentionally engages in collaboration with others, and it involves a higher degree of risk taking, right? Typically, it's because of less funding that's available for these novel ideas. But the affordance of taking the trailblazing approach is that there's that novelty, right? Every time you go, you know, present a paper or make a publication, it's generating something that is a bit outside of the common thinking, right? So this is the type of work that turns heads and it sparks innovation, right, in higher ed. So with that overview, I want to give a note on consensus because the other article or component that I came across in preparing for this, it's Dr. Kristen Wren's presidential address, former ASH president, from a few years ago, where she argues that higher education is a low consensus field. And in sitting with this idea of research agendas, I want to make the case that being a low consensus field is actually a feature of higher ed and not a bug, right? So, what does this mean with consensus? Think of it as the level of agreement among scholars in a field. So, if we were high consensus, for example, in the field of chemistry or physics, then all scholars would have a good sense of what the main problems are, right? Like in physics, I believe they're still pursuing this grand unified theory, right, of how the universe works. That's high consensus because they agree on what problems to tackle and also how to get there. Low consensus means we disagree on even what the problems are. And again, this goes back to the idea that we come from different starting points in higher ed, right? Because I come from a student affairs background, I do have a bias where I look at problems through the lenses of student access and support and success. Whereas someone with a more sociological or policy framework might see more of that broader picture in terms of systems. It's we're not talking about right or wrong. We're just saying there's a level of disagreement that makes it difficult to um, be a cohesive field. But I wanna posit this thought experiment because it underscores this importance of why it's a feature and not a bug. So imagine if tomorrow we all woke up and we all had the same idea of what problems face higher education, as well as how to go about solving them. Well, for one thing, literature reviews would be a lot easier because we all agree on which sources to cite and who's name to drop when we're doing our work. As well, peer review would be a lot easier because when we're reviewing someone's work, we are on the same page conceptually, and we can provide feedback that is built on this common understanding. On the other hand, I want to say that if there's a high consensus, then suddenly competition would go up, right? We would all apply for the same fellowships, scholarships, grants. We would all apply for the same faculty positions with the same specialization. And if you think about it, conference programming, it would be pretty stale pretty quickly because it's all the same sessions. That would be the result of a high consensus field. In contrast, a low consensus field, which is what Dr. Wren says we are, has some challenges, right? But also affordances. So in terms of a challenge, I don't know about you, but whenever I get like a peer review, usually from reviewer two, they probably like they give feedback where they misunderstand my conceptual framework, or they are not charitable in interpreting what I'm saying, right? And that's probably because they see it from a different angle, right? And then they get to show off their own citations and show off their expertise. But that's a consequence of having low consensus, right? So yes, that's a friction point. But think about what that gives us, right? It means there's never a dull moment in conferences. It means there's never a dull moment in thinking about our problems and also thinking about ways to go about solving them, right? So for all the angst that peer reviewers give and receive, right, I do stand by the idea that this is a very interesting field to be in. All right. So that is really the content that I like to provide at the start of a webinar to generate that thinking and, spark ideas. But like I said, the main feature of this webinar is the space that we're creating for participants. Currently, I see there's above 30. And the idea is we want to give everyone time to connect with each other. And how we've done this is we've set up breakout rooms around three different themes. Uh, Breakout room one is going to be on the focus of topics. Think of this as, what are you focused on in higher ed? Breakout room two is more of that discussion on how do we go about higher ed? This is where we can talk about frameworks. And if neither of those two appeal to you, then breakout room three might, because that's a focus on why, right? Like why are we doing what we do? So in terms of instructions, Aaron is going to open up the breakout rooms in a few moments, and all participants here can select their own room that they want to go into. And what's going to happen is I'll share these prompts when you're in your breakout rooms, and it's based on the different themes of the room. So, for example, if you go into the first one, which focuses on the topic, I would like you to have a discussion on what your thesis is about or what your dissertation is on, and then talk about what subfields you would like to develop expertise in, right? And own that idea of developing expertise, right? I get imposter syndrome too, but I know I'm working towards this idea of being an expert in a particular area of higher ed. If you choose room two, which is that focus on frameworks, so more of the conceptual or theoretical material, I invite you to have a conversation on what speaks to you as interesting and impactful research, right? What calls out to you in terms of scholarship, and then discuss what methodologies you want to apply, right? This is really a space where you can nerd out with people. And then the final one is praxis, right? Again, this is the focus on the why we do things. So if you choose this room, I invite you to have discussion around this question, right, which is, from your perspective, what is the biggest problem facing higher education? Spoiler alert, there's no right answer. That's why I say from your perspective. But then the follow-up question is, what are you doing to work on it, right? Because it's one thing to define what the problems are, it's another level to then consider how are we then making strides in addressing those problems. So with all that said, like I said, I'll share this screen once we all go into our breakout rooms. With all that said, Aaron, can you please open up the breakout rooms and then we can get Welcome back, everyone. I hope that was a fruitful conversation in your discussion groups and that you got to share your ideas on the prompts that were given. Because those are the starting points for forming an agenda, right? It's that thought process. So again, forming an agenda for your research was not the goal for this hour. It was more of getting things started. So with that in mind, I'm going to share with you the resource guide that I talked about. So you should see on your screen a QR code. So I'm also going to punch in the link to this resource that's been developed into the chat. So give me one moment to pull it up. Okay. So yeah, the prompts that you went through during your discussion were starting points. There were other prompts that I could have used, but I saved them and I put them all into the document. The document will also contain the references that were cited earlier on in the presentation. I do suggest them as readings because the first one talked more about defining the research agenda, and then they go into the steps to cultivate one. And then the second one, which was the cluster analysis, they get into the real nitty-gritty of how scholars define their work. And I think it's instructive to see how strategic scholars are when they think about their output when it comes to scholarship. Then there's also the ASH presidential address from Dr. Ren. And then there's this final piece on uh, epistemological diversity. Right? And I include that because if you remember from grade school and or high school biology, there's this concept of biological diversity. Right? Like in an ecosystem, when you have different species that are varied, uh, that means they are more robust, right? Like when there's a threat that comes into the ecosystem, it doesn't wipe them all out. Uh, Using that analogy, epistemological diversity means we are varied in our ways of thinking, right? We have different ways of defining problems and different ways of solving them, right? And I think that's important to underscore because, again, if we were talking about high consensus, if we were all the same in our way of thinking and doing, then any one threat to us like from an epistemological standpoint, would be a threat to us all. But because we're low consensus, when those threats show up, we have different tools and different ways to address them, right? So again, I hope the discussion prompts were helpful for you, both in today's session as well as in this resource guide. So, moving on, the last bit is if you found this session helpful, please, I encourage you to look at other ASH events. Tomorrow, as well as Thursday and Friday. Sorry, October 8th. Yeah, that is tomorrow. I'll name it. October is going by fast for me. But yeah, this week we have two sessions. Tomorrow is a presidential webinar on the topic of academic freedom. So if that ended up being one of the topics that were stated as one of interest, I encourage you to look at that one. And then the Thursday and Friday sessions are on international scholarship. So if you're interested in comparative and international higher ed, that might be up your alley. Of course, there are also the conference sessions in November as a representative of the Graduate Student Network. If you want to get more interactions with other grad students, these are the sessions to look for, right? One is an arts-based approach to wellness as well as creative expression. And then the other one is a grad student luncheon. My understanding is that the latter session does have a wait list, but it doesn't hurt to see, how long the line is when you are on site. If you want to check out other events, please keep an eye out for the listserv emails or visit the link at the bottom of the slide. I was talking to Aaron. There's never a dull moment at ASH, right? They always have an ongoing set of activities, and I think they're worth checking out, especially in relation to developing your agenda. So, with all that said, I want to thank you for your time today. If you have any feedback or questions, my email address is on the slide. I welcome input, right? So it helps us design future events for the grad students. So with all that said, I'll stick around for the next few minutes and interact with folks in the chat. Aaron, this would be a cool point to stop recording just for that confidentiality.